Thanks to the Sedona Forum, the McCain Institute, Arizona State University, and Cindy McCain for persevering with the opportunity to hold this important conversation during really challenging circumstances. The reality is that the circumstances we're all living through make the conversations that are being virtually convened through the Sedona Forum this year even more important than ever before. And I'm incredibly pleased and gratified to introduce this conversation about misinformation, disinformation, and the erosion of democracy. I speak to you today as the president and CEO of the Doris Charitable Foundation, but for the past 6 years, I worked at the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, which has long been one of the largest independent supporters of journalism. As we think about today's topic, I'd like to just suggest just a few ideas for you all to consider as you listen to the panelists. First, I think it's important that we be very clear and think critically about what kinds of information and knowledge are important to a democracy. The form that facts take and are disseminated is changing, and we simply can't go back to the days of the newspaper or a few networks. So it's incumbent on us to be clear about what we think we mean when we talk about trustworthy factual information, so that as forms of dissemination evolve, we don't lose the fundamental elements that we see as critical to an informed democracy. Second, we should recognize that while mis and disinformation trade on the power of technology, they stem in part from longstanding movements on both the left and the right to question the Enlightenment legacy that method and inquiry are ultimately essential to separating what we call knowledge from pure information. Now, on the right, this has been an assault from some corners on science and on authoritative institutions. And on the left, this has been an overemphasis at times on the idea that individual experience is the only valid form of truth. Third, it's important that even as we begin to address the critical questions of how the companies that control the flow of new forms of information and dissemination curate information on their platforms, we don't leave out basic questions about the economic and regulatory structure of the technology sector in our lives, in our country, and in our world. The scale and speed of platforms like Facebook and Google are not natural inevitabilities. They are possibilities that we can choose to enable and encourage or prohibit and discourage. And those choices are really up to us as a society. I've been asked to give sort of my favorite memory of Senator John McCain. I was actually a teenager when the Straight Talk Express first hit the road. And I think we're living at a time when the idea of driving around and actually physically talking to people about their lives seems at best inefficient, and at worst maybe anachronistic. But after a year of pandemic and quarantine, I think we are all realizing that technology, and particularly technology for communication, can supplement and enhance our lives, but it doesn't replace the bonds of trust and human connection that come from real physical proximity and real face-to-face conversation. I think Senator McCain understood that reality intuitively, and if he were with us today, I'm certain that he would be challenging us to recover that spirit in ways and forms that are relevant to our time. American democracy has been the best example of how economic and political liberalism go together. Free markets with appropriate restraint make democracy stronger, and strong democracies help us use markets to grow prosperity, opportunity, and equality. We should insist that global social media companies participate in advancing these same high ideals. If this is a one-sided deal, where with government and civil society forcing companies to behave in certain ways, then we have truly lost the spirit of partnership across sectors that has made our democracy great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation.
Hello, I'm Nicholas Thompson. I'm the CEO of The Atlantic, and I am delighted to be here for what should be a fantastic conversation about misinformation, disinformation, and the erosion of democracy. I'm joined by Sheldon Whitehouse, He is a senator from Rhode Island, and as I learned in the green room, a Patriots fan. We have David Axelrod. He is the founder and director of the Institute of Politics. He was a senior advisor to Barack Obama, and he is a fan of all Chicago sports, and he would like a new quarterback. With Lelah Ispahani, who is the managing director of Open Society US, and she is a fan of cricket. Welcome, everyone.
Good to be with you, Nick.
All right, let's talk about misinformation and disinformation. Senator Whitehouse, I'm going to start with you. I can make the argument that the problem is actually getting better. We talk about it. It's clearly bad. It clearly hasn't gone away. We know from January that there are catastrophic problems of misinformation and disinformation in this country. But it's also the case that the tech platforms are paying more attention to it. It's also the case that we're more attuned. Is the problem getting worse, or is it getting better?
I would say it's still pretty much steady state. There are places where it's getting better. I think there are also areas where it's getting worse. Things that are flat out conspiracy theory nonsense are being echoed and touted now by elected officials, not just people who are sitting in their mother's basement. So the thing that I would want to focus on is not so much the people who are in their mother's basement, the cranks and the oddballs. I think we can kind of set that all aside. And to a certain extent, we can set aside the international misinformation, disinformation campaigns, the stuff that Putin was running, because we're supposed to have a national security establishment that deals with that. I think the dangerous place right now is in the strategic domestic disinformation space, where a very powerful industry or apparatus has a big motive to create disinformation, is systematic about pushing out disinformation to achieve its motive, and remains anonymous, so it's not accountable for the disinformation that it puts out. And it's that space in all of this that I think is the most dangerous. And in that space, I don't see any sign of improvement.
Explain more specifically by what you mean by that apparatus. Like name.
Well, I mean, the most obvious example is the fossil fuel industry's climate denial apparatus, right? As soon as the tobacco industry was told by the Department of Justice that it had to stop lying, it had all this apparatus lying around with no use any longer. And there was the fossil fuel industry ready to pick it up, repurpose it to climate denial, expand it dramatically, flood it with money, and then hide the fossil fuels hand in all of this behind a bunch of shady front groups with very anodyne sounding names. And it's that apparatus that I've paid the most attention to, and it remains very aggressive and very effective. And in the political world, Democrats don't have a very good counterpoint to it yet.
David, would you agree with that diagnosis? Would you say that the central problem is this well-funded apparatus and that climate change denialists are at the center of it?
Well, look, I think that is one more symptom of the problem. Let me just echo one thing the senator said. It is very hard after witnessing an insurrection at the Capitol and looking at polling in which you still have 60 to 80% of Republicans, variously depending on the poll, or conservatives saying that the last election was riven with fraud, riddled by fraud, and in many cases agreeing with the notion that the election was illegitimate. And we know that there is no evidence to support that. And yet it has become, an accepted fact among large numbers of Americans who get their information through social media, get their information obviously from news sites as well. So, this is a huge problem. But I will say it's not just how people use the platforms to advance misinformation and disinformation. It's also the platforms themselves. Nick, you say things are getting better, there's awareness. And yes, I think there is awareness on the part of the platforms. And I think there also is an awareness that they have a huge public relations problem as a result of it. But that hasn't changed their algorithms so far as I can see. And that is the problem. Their business model relies on exciting people to stay on the platforms, and they do that by pairing them up with provocative sites. And so, 64% of the people who wound up on extremist sites were sent there by algorithms on Facebook. That, it seems to me, hasn't changed, and that's a big source of concern.
In that answer, Lelah, David centered the platforms as the kind of the source of much of this misinformation. Would you think that is a fair analysis, or would you put more of the discredit on television networks, the book industry, speakers? Like, are the platforms the majority, the plurality? How big a part do they play in this problem?
I think they play a huge part of it, but it is completely true that there's a feedback loop from traditional media to social media, from Tucker Carlson to AM radio to places with actually much more reach than some social media platforms. But I'd like to just make a couple of points, because I really do fear or think that the real question is whether we'd survive another authoritarian government if we did nothing about our social media. They have made, it's your question, Nick, they've made some progress, but it's been really a little bit too little and a little bit too late. And the pressure that it took to get that progress in the last 5 years, rights violations, hate, misinformation, all of this has been increasing, right? We've had attorneys general acting, we've had civil rights organizations acting, we've had so many influencers acting. And what you have now is a few fact checkers, right? You have a civil rights ombudsman at Facebook, but they're too big to regulate, these companies, the behemoths, Facebook, Google, YouTube. Their audience is huge because people don't have a choice but to participate. Their scale means bad information can be easily amplified. And if we thought the antidote was decentralization or an adequate supply of good journalism, they've eroded both, right? So the point, I just wanted to make the point about how hard it's been to get even very modest changes, and those changes are very narrowly tailored to the specific harm you raise. We've, as foundations, we've gone to them. Civil society organizations have gone directly to the CEOs. There's no benevolent CEO model here. We've gone there and you bring them these problems, and they will make a small fix here or there. So it's really about, it ultimately is about needing regulation. I'll just say as the last thing, I think 2020 gave us all the information we needed for the fact that this is really, really a problem. The platform companies could not manage the scale of misinformation from a pandemic on top of political disinformation. It wasn't just a few people that were wrong on the internet, right? It was millions exposed to dangerous medical misinformation disguised as physicians' advice, while we're also witnessing what happens when thousands of people believe a lie so big that they're willing to storm the Capitol. I mean, the internet is literally a crime scene. So I think that was the year we realized that it's failing and what the consequences are. But ultimately, it doesn't even matter. It's the business model question that was just raised. It doesn't matter that they care a lot even about the problem. It matters how they address it and whether they're willing to lose the money to make that fix.
Well, I definitely want to dig into this question of how to regulate the platforms, but let me get to one of the big issues that they had, which I think ties into what you've all said. So one of the problems, and I've spent a lot of time talking about this question with the people who run these companies, and one of the arguments you hear, on background or, off the record or on background is, well, the problem is that all the misinformation comes from the right. So if you crack down hard on misinformation, you look like you're censoring, right? And you can see the bind that puts them in, right? Half their users are Republicans, half their users are Democrats. They don't want to look like they're censoring. So how do you solve that? Well, one way you could just tell them to have more spine. Another way would be try to get the right to put out less misinformation. The other way would be to get the left to put out more disinformation. If the left put out a lot of disinformation, it would be easier for the tech platforms. So my question for David or Sheldon, have you ever been in a meeting where somebody made that argument and said it's time for the left to put out more disinformation so the tech companies can justify cracking down on everybody?
Actually, I've been in meetings in which
I don't hang around with the diabolical groups that he does, so I've not heard that, but
I've actually heard the opposite in meetings that I've been in, that over and over again, the Republicans discover a political weapon like partisan gerrymandering, and it takes us 2 or 3 cycles to catch up and use it. But that on this question of putting out equivalent counteracting disinformation, we should draw the line on that. That's the proper response is to expose it, not to mimic it.
Yeah, I thoroughly agree with that. I also, I mean, not to make an unduly partisan point, but there is a question right now as to what is it about the politics of the Republican Party in the era of Trump that has allowed this to penetrate so deeply, within that party. And I think there may be things about the sort of psychology of the Trump movement and the Republican Party that lends itself more readily to the kind of outrage that fuels participation on these sites and the spreading rumors. I will note that we now have 2 members of Congress who are adherents of QAnon, and we treat that as if that's normal. That's how pervasive some of these themes have become. Some of these memes have become space lasers from space lasers run by Jews, starting forest fires in California. It's a big problem.
Well, let me ask all 3 of you then a question on this. Obviously, one of the big themes of this conversation will be how to counter disinformation. And one of the things we learned in the media is that oftentimes countering disinformation, you amplify it, right? You write a story about something that someone said that is false, or somebody made a bad tweet that was false, and only 3 people saw the original tweet, and then we write a story and 5 million people have seen it. How do you think about this issue in politics? When do you decide to counter disinformation? When do you ignore disinformation? And has your framework changed? Lelah, you want to go first?
I mean, you never amplify it. You just never amplify it. From our own work, what we've done is we've really connected civil society advocates with researchers and with journalists. And so there's a virtuous circle there where civil society organizations, they can't even meet their goals, the strategic goals, because all they're doing is battling disinformation. Instead of sort of giving people in last year's elections information about the time, place, and manner of voting, all they were doing is battling information. The researchers are beginning to help them recognize it. And then what the journalists do is they see what the experience of disinformation is for these communities, and they sort of start to relay it accurately. So, but the cardinal rule really remains: you never amplify it, you never repeat it. It's sort of like the old adage with voter fraud. Unfortunately, we've been repeating it, even Democrats, for years and years and years. We never quite got it right, and so we still live with that specter of voter fraud.
I mean, that makes sense, but let's go to a specific example. David, maybe Trump tweeted, let's say, I don't know, 1,000 false things, maybe more.
Yeah, I think you're being modest.
He tweeted a lot of false things. Tell me how you thought about responding to those false things at the beginning and at the end, and how that evolution of your thinking will affect how you respond when the next Republican presidential candidate tweets something false.
No, listen, it is a challenging thing. I mean, the Washington Post, cataloged 30,000 lies, including on social media. That got a lot of attention. But the problem we have is that we live in virtual media silos. So is the information getting, even if you counter, does your counter reach people who are susceptible to the misinformation? And that, I think, is one of the troubling dilemmas here. I completely agree with the notion that you don't want to elevate these things. But, I go back all the way to 2016 when this insane QAnon notion that Hillary Clinton was part of a global pedophile ring and there were children in the basement of a pizzeria in Washington, and some young man came up there with weapons thinking he was going to bust this pedophilia ring. How do you, that reached 2.5 million people. So the question is, how do you penetrate that? And how do you break through the hard silos in which people are getting their information, too often getting their information today, where their views are affirmed oftentimes not informed.
Well, actually, let me stick with that, and I want to ask you a media question because you're a former reporter, famously. I worry sometimes that my industry is making the silos problem worse, and potentially in two ways. One is, we've all moved to paywall models. It was my main initiative I worked on at the New Yorker. But what that's meant is that the highest quality information is expensive, and the lower quality information is free, right? So that could be a problem. And secondly, there are lots of people who look at my industry. I spent the last 4 years of Wired somewhat removed from this, but there are a lot of people who would say that the news industry became more partisan and more siloed over the 4 years of Trump, in part because of the strong opposition to him for lots of reasons. Do you think that the mainstream media, David, is making the silos problem worse, and because of that, making it harder to crack this misinformation problem?
Well, let's separate these issues out. I do think that so much of this swirls around how people make money, how the platforms make money, how news organizations make money. I love the Washington Post. I love the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic. I subscribe to all of them.
Beautiful.
But I also recognize that many Americans will not. And so, in a sense, you're preaching to the choir in some ways. So, yeah, I do think that is a problem, because where the real crisis is in America in the news business is in local markets, where we've lost 1,700 outlets, and you have news deserts, and there's a lot of trust placed in those local news markets, and there's a void that needs to be filled there. But yeah, so that is one issue. Look, I do believe, what happened with Trump was he was so antagonistic and so provocative that at times I think very, very great, good journalists got drawn into the fray in ways that perhaps they shouldn't have. But the other thing is, how do you say something is a lie without people on the other side saying, well, you're being partisan? I mean, the fact is, objectively, Donald Trump lied for practice every single day. It was his modus operandi. And so it is the job of the media to say, here are the facts. But just in doing that, given the environment in which we operate, that becomes seen as a partisan act, and it reinforces his message and his goal, which was basically to create an atmosphere of mistrust and he told Leslie Stahl this before the election. I don't want them to trust you, because when you guys write stuff that's not positive about me, I don't want people to believe it. And that basically, one thing about Donald Trump is he's about as subtle as a screen door on a submarine. He tells you what he's going to do, and he did it.
And as Steve Bannon famously said, the only way to counter the media is to flood the zone with shit, if I remember his quote correctly. Sheldon, let me ask you a variation on that question, which is the partisanship worse in the local Rhode Island politics you deal with, or in the national politics you deal with?
National by far.
And is that partly a media issue? Like, tell me about the partisan divide and how people read the press in Providence.
I don't think we have much of a partisan divide in Rhode Island. We obviously have a lot of Trump voters. We have a lot of, Hillary, Obama, Biden voters, but you don't get the kind of toxicity that we see in the national debate. And none of our media outlets are propagating any of the crazy falsehoods. So it's a little bit like going back 5 years in Rhode Island compared to where we are with the national press. And I'd push my point again. I think the danger zone here is the area in which the disinformation is systematic, has a motive, and has anonymous backers behind it. And I think a lot of this stuff calms down once the proponent of the disinformation is identified. And we've been terrible at that. The Facebook, Al Franken famously caught Facebook running political TV ads with payments denominated in rubles anonymously. So when Zuckerberg came before our committee to try to clean up his act a little bit, he said, that's never going to happen again. We now have a new rule where if you're going to buy political ads on Facebook, you have to tell us who you are. Well, it turned out that the who you are that you had to tell Facebook was just whatever front group you put up there. You could open Boris and Natasha LLC in Nevada, and that would be who they would be satisfied with without knowing who the actual proponent is behind the screens. So it was amateurish for smart people to the point of making one wonder whether they really wanted to clean this up or not.
As a reporter, if I saw Boris and Natasha LLC in Nevada, I would dig into that one.
But it would have satisfied Facebook, is my point. It would have satisfied Facebook. They would have run the ad.
It was a serious problem. There's no question about it. Well, let's then talk about solutions. Lelah, let's see. If Open Society said to you, you know what? Here's another $1 billion. Do whatever you want, but the only KPI we care about, you can tell that I'm now a CPI, not a journalist. I just used CEO, not a journalist. I just used KPI. The only thing we care about is reducing disinformation and misinformation. How do you allocate that $1 billion?
So we may, in fact, have $1 billion to spend, as you know. And we've spent
all right, $10 billion, something more than you have at Open Society. $100 billion.
We've spent quite a lot of time, thinking about this and soliciting sort of really good ideas. And it's not clear. It's not easy, right? I mean, ideally, you create a platform with public interest values at its core. And the reason it's not easy is because of the platforms we currently have. You can't pick up your data and contacts with you and go to the new utopia. It's also hard because if we've learned anything from the past 10 years, it's that people of all political inclinations harbor tendencies to seek out something salacious, at least from time to time. And these tendencies flourish in the absence of guardrails. So we're going to have to choose a different reality, but that choice has to be real. And it can't happen when we have to leave behind government services, all commercial interactions, and all of our data when we leave these dominant platforms. And the same, it's also got to be, you raised this point earlier, disinformation and misinformation isn't limited to the online world. It's plentiful on traditional media with the feedback loop, as I mentioned, from Tucker Carlson to online rumor and back to Fox News or AM radio, which really reach far more Americans than Twitter. So we need a holistic solution. The scale is $1 billion solution. And also these problems are global. I know we've been talking mainly about the US, but this has to work for countries all over the globe. As we set standards, we need to make sure they work in the global South. And the other piece I think you hear is that it's about cost, right? Who bears the cost? So people with huge networks, sites with huge networks also have to bear some of the cost if they traffic in disinformation. Influencers, pundits, no one on this call, platforms, politicians, journalists, no one on this call. But not just people to whom the harms are exported, right? So those with huge reach also have to be held to these standards, just as we hold broadcast and print responsible. There are local solutions, there are experiments that are taking place, and we've been trying to track them and see where we can start to do some amplification. There are hyperlocal social networks. I don't know if you've ever heard of the Vermont Front Porch. It was founded 21 years ago. So it predated these platforms now offered by Facebook to communities. And it ends up that the secret to running a healthy online community of neighbors is healthy moderation and non-surveillance advertising. They sell advertising space to local businesses and nonprofits. The ads are distributed by geography and by date, and that's it. So you can get positive virality through more and more of this. So, there are also some examples of newspapers, but I will stop here.
No, that's marvelous. You gave at least 3 fascinating policy solutions in there. 1, mandating data portability. 2, perhaps antitrust, so that you can have smaller networks pop up. And 3rd, some kind of penalty for false information. So let's take those 3. Senator, should we have a law mandating data portability from the major tech platforms? When I leave Facebook, should I be able to take not just my contact list and the history of everything I've posted, but the company's proprietary data on what they know about my behavior patterns and move it to a new social network?
Probably. You get into really complicated questions here. Do they get to keep it when you take it to your new platform so you don't have to rebuild? It's that's more complicated than this format, I think, allows. So I just say two very simple things. Repeal Section 230 so that they face liability. Look at the example of what lawsuits did to InfoWars and coming up on Fox News when they really trafficked in disgraceful stuff. They were sued and they had to pay for it. And then just disclosure. Facebook should require that they know who the person is who's putting information up on their platform, and the real person, not some Russian nesting doll of intermediaries. And we should require the same thing for all election and election-related spending. And if we do that, I think a lot of disinformation will go away, and we'll have a much clearer problem set to focus on.
Repeal Section 230 for everybody, or just repeal Section 230 for the big guys? Because if you repeal it for everybody, then the poor Vermont social network is going to get sued out of existence on Tuesday. They're not going to be able to hire a lawyer.
For sure for the big ones. I don't know how far down you go. And of course, it raises the question, what do you then replace it with? Because I'm not sure that a flat repeal leaves us in the best state. It may be that we need to backfill and replace it. And we're working on that in the Senate right now. But I think at this point, these brutes are so big that the idea that they should be immune from ordinary consequences of cause, effect, and judgment that apply to everybody else in the country, including the major TV networks and talk shows and so forth, it just doesn't make any sense any longer. They're not the backyard garage shops any longer. They're the biggest companies in America. They don't need it, they don't deserve it, and they've abused it.
David, do you agree?
Yeah, I do. I think that, yes, liability is important, but the other words that my colleagues here have used is also transparency. And I think that's really important. People have no idea sort of how their data is used, how they are being targeted, how their information is being conveyed. I think that would be really important. I do think that antitrust is something that should be looked at, because one of the things that you want to encourage are competitive social media networks that operate under a different protocol, as Lelah suggested. And I mentioned earlier the news deserts. I would, if I had $1 billion, I'd invest in not-for-profit local news operations. There's a great one in Michigan, Bridge, Michigan. It's a sensational news site, very straight down the middle, and it operates with foundation money and subscriptions. I would also media literacy is important, but I also would fund research. The most important thing that was said here is we don't exactly know what's going to work and what's not going to work, and so doing a lot of things and testing and trying to find out what the most effective ways to go forward would be important, and I'd use some of that money to do that.
Well, that all sounds very promising. Let's go to I think probably the most controversial part of the three ideas I heard from Lelah. So that would be consequences for individuals who spread misinformation, right? So somebody knowingly puts out a false tweet about COVID that is demonstrably false and causes harm. Should that person face consequences? You can imagine a situation where a court says that caused $1 million in harm, half to the companies, half to the individual. Do we want that? Or is that too great an imposition on our rights to free speech?
Well, I think the law can figure that out. Right now, if you fire a gun in the air and the bullet lands on someone and they're injured as a result of it, even if it's miles away and neither party knows the other, there are ways in which the law can figure out how to redress those injuries. And I don't think we need a whole lot of special purpose-built apparatus to deal with one individual uses a social media weapon to hurt another individual. If you can get that through juries, that's fine. And if you can't, I think the law in its development will handle that pretty well on its own.
But right now, I can tweet, I don't know, don't take your COVID vaccine, or I can tweet misinformation about climate change, or I can tweet a big lie about Georgia, and there's no consequence. I know there's no consequence. There's no consequence if Elon Musk tweets that, and he has all the money in the world. So the law has to be different if we want there to be consequences than what it is right now.
So there are.
I'm not sure you're right about that. I think that by the time you've shown that you have standing to bring that case, by the time you've shown that you've actually suffered an injury, by the time you've shown that that injury was predictable and reasonably to be anticipated by the harm doer, you've narrowed the population of who can sue over something pretty small. The fact pattern that you announced doesn't necessarily lend itself to any litigation whatsoever. I think at the other end of the spectrum, you have the Department of Justice tobacco litigation, right? Where the Department of Justice sued the tobacco industry because it was lying about its product. And they won that case. It was a smashing knockdown of the tobacco industry, and they were under court order to stop the lying as the result. So we have a pretty good model out there as to how this actually can be done. And I don't think you need Section 230 to intrude into the middle of that.
So, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we have a model for how this can be done, and yet it's not being done, right? Because misinformation isn't slowing and people aren't worrying about the consequences. So what do we need to do differently for the legal system as it's currently comprised to have more of an incentivizing effect on people spreading disinformation? And that's
for the platforms, it's repealing Section 230, because that's what insulates them. If you're the Sandy Hook mom who sued InfoWars for saying that all of their children were faking it, that there wasn't a real killing there, the system worked. The lawsuit went forward. They got a big enough judgment that nobody wanted to disclose it. That young man who was leaving the DNC headquarters and the right wing accused Hillary Clinton of having arranged his murder, there was a judgment against someone who was propagating that lie. And right now, Dominion's in court, and they're going to tear the skin off of Fox News and Giuliani and people like that for the campaign of lies that they launched against Dominion as collateral damage as they tried to discredit the election. So I think it actually is working reasonably well if you let it work.
Okay. Lelah, you want to jump in here?
I was just going to mention both the Dominion lawsuit, which Senator Whitehouse just mentioned, as well as the Smartmatic lawsuit against Fox. So it's, again, both traditional media and the lawsuits that Dominion are bringing might bring us to some different kinds of accountability. But also the issue is really scale, right? I mean, if you're an individual and you post misinformation, that's going to happen. We're living in this connected universe. But I really do think that the analogy to tobacco industries work because it deals with the scale problem, right? There's an analogy to secondhand smoke, for example. So tobacco industries resisted regulation on the grounds that smoking was a personal freedom, right? Until the 1980s, 1990s. But when it was shown that smoking harmed other people, regulators moved in, right? And maybe not by now we've seen enough harm to make the case that amplification at scale of inaccurate, hateful, harassing, and harmful speech can lead to serious damage in real life. And an unregulated private sector hasn't solved this problem alone, cannot solve it alone, especially when the business model is premised on engagement, not on content.
Let's stick with that.
Can I just raise a question, which is, what is the responsibility of these platforms having profited off of driving people to these sites where they are misinformed? What is their responsibility to straighten out the misinformation? I know that, Twitter started labeling some tweets and so on, but I haven't seen a major campaign on the part of Facebook to tell people that the last election was not fraudulent. What are the responses? This goes back to the issue of platforms who kind of profit off of all of this, but want to wash their hands of responsibility for doing anything about it. I guess I'm just posing that as a question. I
can jump in unless Senator Whitehouse, you'd like to jump in first.
No, all yours.
I mean, this is why I think it's regulation, and it's perhaps we even need an Internet Protection Agency, right? An IPA on the model of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, And what you do then is you treat technology as a process and not a product, right? It's not a solution to say we should all get off the internet. It's where we live. People work, they talk to doctors, find their news. Even the big platforms have some liberating elements, right? In the post-Trump era, they enabled never Trump organizations and resistance organizations to grow, like Indivisible, as one example. And in 2020, in a pandemic, people could register to vote online and do much more. And more broadly, other technology has positive applications, as we all know, cameras deterring police misconduct, and in India, stemming corruption if you find, a bribe in motion taking place. But technology is also changing quickly, so we shouldn't just focus on the existing platforms. I mean, the really insidious ones are like Gab and Parler, who don't care about democracy at all. I think we should start sort of focusing on those and the next generations and the next iterations of those. And so an agency of this sort of, that I just mentioned, an IPA, Internet Protection Agency of some kind, would ensure that there's oversight across all platforms, old and new, and that consumer rights, user rights are protected.
Yeah, but so here's my question to you, though. I'm just to repeat my basic question, and I don't know the answer to this, but if there is a theme that the election was stolen and all of the things that some of which were touched upon by the lawsuits that were filed, but so on, are being propagated. Facebook, just as an example, is driving everyone to these sites. That's how these things grow. Where in the system do you reach these people to tell them, actually, the things you're hearing are not true? I mean,
you want a fairness doctrine 2.0?
I kind of do. I mean, I do think they have some responsibility when massive lies are told that wind up leading to an insurrection in the Capitol and are, spread among millions and millions of people. I do think there's some obligation to say, you should know this has been disproven. It's not true. It's deadly relative to the pandemic. I just think there has to be some sense of responsibility there to make sure that people get, genuine facts in the face of these kinds of grotesque, lies.
So this is where the algorithms are a real problem, right? They build these algorithms, and the algorithms tell you what you're going to look at, and they track what your habits are. And if I'm looking for a job, it's not going to show me all the jobs I might be wanting to look for, or an apartment, or anything like that. So there's a couple of things you can do more immediately. You named one earlier, which was transparency, and I mean here transparency to researchers. These platforms don't allow researchers from the outside to have any access. And in fact, when there was a situation when NYU tried to gain some access, some researchers there, and Facebook had a pretty severe reaction. So there's an issue there that if they can actually allow these expert researchers, they might be able to help them and work with them. And there's also content moderation. They barely allow any content moderation, right? I mean, some of these other innovations in other communities with smaller social network type of local social networks, they're quite heavily moderated. Now, maybe you can't go all that way, but you could have much more content moderation. Go ahead.
Keep going.
Yeah. No, so there are some fixes, but yes, the truth is these platforms are already quite built, and that's what I meant earlier when I said they're going to be super hard to really regulate effectively.
So I want to see if I can, in the last 10 minutes, flip part of this around, because it's clear that the solution to this will have some element of sanctioning the big platforms, regulating the big platforms, convincing the big platforms to work differently, to reshape their algorithms, to hire more content moderators, to set up firmer policies. But I also wonder whether, if we're going to be spending billions and billions of dollars, whether there's a way to look at creating new platforms or new spaces, right? So one of the weirdest things to me about disinformation is that the place with the best information, besides some of the news media, the best information on COVID is Wikipedia, right? So somehow the public place, the one place that doesn't have a profit model, has become this beacon of truth on COVID. And it's made me wonder, are there ways to create, to fund, to incentivize other public spaces where there's a much better signal to noise, truth to mistruth ratio? How does one do that?
I don't know, because I don't know Wikipedia well enough. So I'll go back to where I started. I think if you're forcing the proponent of the misinformation to disclose who they are, that cleans up the channel that they are on, and it gives the reader or the viewer or the citizen the essential information of being able to understand the motive and the messenger behind the message, so that you get a complete understanding of what's being done. And I think if you do that, it will clean up a lot of the sites. Why Wikipedia is pure, I think has a lot to do with the way they so constantly self-police, and that there's just a huge number of eyeballs on the creation of that content.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, this goes back to transparency. People have a sense of where the information's coming from. They footnote it, they cite it. It is a not-for-profit. They have no idea. I mean, everything is opaque in terms of how you get information on Facebook, for example. So that, there is a lot to be learned from Wikipedia, I think.
Well, let's talk then. Let's go back a minute to the smaller social networks issue. So one of the things that has come up is that we've discussed smaller social networks both as sort of idealistic platforms, right? Social network in Vermont that doesn't have targeted advertising, people tell truth, but also Parler and Gab. And so one of the questions that often comes up and that I'm stuck on is, if antitrust happens and if antitrust is successful and these big companies are split apart, right? Facebook is hived off, WhatsApp and Instagram are hived off from Facebook, YouTube hived off from Google. If you end up having a large number of smaller social networks, do they compete on the good stuff or do they compete on the bad stuff? Because they're all trying to get engagement.
So is your question particularly about sort of some of the newer networks, not like Parler and Gab, which
I'm wondering, I guess I'll rephrase it.
Yep.
Is the best way to fix the media ecosystem to have the same number of big platforms that we have, but to regulate them more tightly, to incentivize them in different ways? Or is the best way to have many other platforms and hope that they compete in ways that lead to a healthier information ecosystem?
Well, I mean, I think you need both decentralization and you need more truthful information, right? I mean, that they go hand in hand, and so you need more local journalism, and that there are experiments in local journalism that are getting very sophisticated and smart. Also need amplification. There's a in the Mountain West, there's a series of these small weeklies, and now this is run by a family, and now what they're trying to do is build some social media properties around them. So that's it. There are things that, in addition to just other small social media platforms that are hyperlocal, they're sort of promising.
I don't know if the problem is anonymized manure in the information ecosystem, that having 12 cups of anonymized manure rather than one 12-cup bucket of anonymized manure is improving the situation much. I think you've got to go to the kind of underlying conditions of how the information gets to these platforms and what the recipient is also entitled to know, and what the role of the platform is in disclosing finding out and disclosing who is the propagator of the manure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, and I think the question is also, can you create platforms that have a different protocol and a different way of operating that can still, either they're not for profit like Wikipedia, or they find they market around having a different protocol about how they handle data and how they disclose things, and maybe appeal to people in that way. But if you're just going to break them up and they're all essentially operating under the same modus operandi, I don't think that gets you anywhere.
All right, so we just have a couple of minutes left. Why don't we go around and talk about, from this conversation or something we haven't brought up, what is the most important thing you hope will happen in the next year or two to help rid us of this manure, or at least plant some delicious arugula in it?
Well, I'll jump in, and before we go, just because this is John McCain's thing, I saw him last night on the Hemingway show. I didn't expect to see him. He just popped onto the screen as I was watching it, and it filled my heart to see his face again. And so, just a word of honor and thought to our friend John. I think we've got to pursue the question of disclosure very broadly. We just did something very important in the Senate in passing the law requiring American shell corporations to disclose to Treasury, to FinCEN, who the real beneficial owner is. And that's the first real forward movement we've had in this space. And kleptocracy and Cayman Islands and all of that mess needs transparency. Our platforms need transparency. I think a lot of dirty things get done in the dark, and we've got to just spotlights everywhere is going to be much better for everyone.
All right. David?
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree with that. So what did Justice Brandeis say? Sunshine is the greatest disinfectant. That is particularly true here. The need is extraordinary for and urgent for transparency. But I want to also follow Sheldon's point about Senator McCain, because the other thing, and we haven't talked about it, and yes, we've done a little bit better with it because people are aware of it, is how social media has been weaponized, and our adversaries have found out how to undermine our democracy on the cheap by being a force behind some of this misinformation. And we've seen it, relative to the virus and other things. That the fundamental operational idea of our autocratic opponents is that democracy is spent, and that we don't have the wherewithal to solve our own problems anymore because we're too divided. And they found a weapon to help advance that theory. And so, I think there needs to be a recognition on the part of Americans about that as well, and just how perilous that is, as perilous as bombs and other kinds of weapons.
All right, Lelah, final thoughts?
Look, long ago we could agree on at least many facts, right? Certain, at least core truths about our democracy. We had broad agreement at least on the right to vote as a fundamental right. Today, of course, that notion is even contested. And we can't call a lie, even a very big lie, and agreed, it's something we agree on. But there's also some bipartisan agreement here on some of these policy reforms. And I think that there's a hopeful note there on certainly on the questions of power of the media platforms. We haven't talked about the lawsuit brought by 48 attorneys general in the US Federal Trade Commission, right, against Facebook based on its aggressive acquisitions of Instagram, WhatsApp, and others, and the other suit against Google, even by the Trump Department of Justice and 11 attorneys general over antitrust allegations. So, we enforce what's on the books. We need something more comprehensive, yes. And then, and I mentioned my idea of an internet protection agency if we can get there. But I also wanted to end with something about John McCain, because I was thinking about individual acts of courage, right? Perhaps not from old school mavericks like him, who spoke up when right-wing actors just spouted dangerous nonsense about President Obama, but acts of courage nonetheless. We saw some from Adam Kinzinger, who joined his 10 other House members to vote, 10 other Republican House members to strip Marjorie Taylor Greene of committee assignments, who, by the way, her disinformation pays her bills. She raised over $3.2 million in the first quarter of 2021, basically benefiting from the controversies that have been consuming her in those months, most notably using the media and relying on QAnon to cause controversy, and very sadly going after after David Hogg. But the acts of courage of Kinzinger, and also even the Chamber of Commerce, right? The Chamber of Commerce came in and uncharacteristically entered the fray, spoke to those members of Congress who were disregarding certified election results as undermining democracy and the rule of law, spoke up again in the wake of the Capitol insurrection to defend democratic norms. So these kinds of acts of courage exist, and we need more of them.
All right. Well, that is a wonderful note to end on. Thank you for a fabulous discussion. 45 minutes of truth about misinformation. Thank you so much to the Sedona Forum. I hope we have lots more bipartisanship in the spirit of John McCain. Thank you so much. See you later.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, David. Bye.